Well, good morning, y'all. Hope you guys had a good time last night at the Best of Westridge concert. I want to give a special thanks to Michael and Sean, who actually made it sound like I could sing last night, so I appreciate that. But it's a long weekend for these guys, and we really appreciate all you do, so thank you. We are in the middle of a series entitled How Little Can I Do and Still Get into Heaven, as we've been exploring this idea of what is the minimum threshold for us to get green lighted so that we can pass through those pearly gates at the end of the day. And last week we talked about how little we can do for other people and still get into heaven. And today we're going to explore how little can we give and still get into heaven. I think that probably the best place to start is what the church typically teaches as what is the minimum threshold for giving, and that is the idea of tithing, right? So I'd love to be able to stand up here and to tell you that the Bible commands us to tithe, and this is what has to happen, because if everybody in the church tithed, we'd never have to worry about money ever. And for those of you who don't know, tithing is the act of giving 10% of your income to God. So while many people may practice it, it certainly is a solid biblical principle, especially in the Old Testament of the Bible, where giving 10% is definitely something that is done on a regular basis. An example in the book of Malachi in the Old Testament says, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord God Almighty, and see if I don't throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you'll not even have enough room for it." However, as we get into the New Testament, the idea of tithing kind of gets pushed aside. And so what I thought I'd do as a starting point this morning is to give you a choice before we get into the rest of the message. And if you want to choose to opt out of tithing this morning, you can do that. And instead, if you would prefer to follow the New Testament plan for giving, then that might be a better option for you, and you can opt into that. And you know I'm setting you up, right? Because the Old Testament idea of tithing gets pushed aside for the New Testament teaching of a little something called sacrificial giving, right? It even sounds a little rough, right? And just in case you didn't pick up on it, the root word of that is sacrifice. And it's defined, just so we're very clear, it's defined as surrendering something that is prized or greatly desired for the sake of something considered to be more meaningful and personally valuable, which means that for us here this morning, we may all be in a little bit of trouble. So let me just be clear about something, as I know people can get a little uptight when we talk about money. At the end of the message, I'm not going to ask for a special offering. I'm not going to ask you for anything else. Truly, I don't know how this sounds, but I really do want something for you as a result of this message. I want, at the end of this message, to be able to have you have a new sense for why you give, to actually have an excitement about giving, if that's possible, and how giving will impact you if you start to give, period, and start to give in a more meaningful way, and how we can grow spiritually as a result of giving meaningfully, as making that part of our lives. All right? So it's a lot in about 20 minutes, but that's my hope for what happens this morning. And so what I want to do, I think, is to build a theology of giving by looking at a passage of Scripture that the Apostle Paul wrote in a letter to the Corinthians. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, I think that the Apostle Paul really addresses this idea of giving in the church. And so by way of background, I think it's important just to note that Paul is speaking about an offering that is being taken for the church in Jerusalem. The church in Jerusalem apparently was underwater financially. There were things going on. There was hardship. And so he was asking some other churches to contribute. And while he's writing this letter to the church of Corinth, and he's asking them to consider a gift, he uses the churches over in Macedonia as an example of what that kind of giving should and could look like. So let me read from 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I'll start out in verse 1. It says, "Now I want you to know what God's grace has done through the churches in Macedonia. They've had a lot of trouble, and they're very poor. And they also are filled with an abundant joy which has overflowed into rich generosity. For I can testify that they gave not only what they could afford, but far more, even beyond their ability. And they did it of their own free will. They pleaded with us again and again for the privilege of sharing in the gift of those in need in Jerusalem. They even did more than we hoped. Since you, church at Corinth, excel in so many ways, in your faith, your knowledge, your enthusiasm for God, and your love, I also want you to excel in this gracious act of giving." So Paul says to the church of Corinth, hey, as you're thinking about if and what to give, I just want to let you know what the churches over in Macedonia did. And these would be the churches that were in cities like Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea, which are now all over part of modern-day Greece. And he says, these churches have created a model for what God's intent is for what giving should be like. These churches were particularly poor, it sounds like. They were experiencing a recession themselves, I would guess, that might look like our 2008, 2009. So the money wasn't flowing and times were tough. And Paul describes them as being extremely poor, but in spite of their poverty, they were incredibly generous. And so out of this passage, I want to pull out what I think are some very strong biblical principles as to what giving should be like and what is the minimum that God may expect me to give. All right? So the first biblical principle that I want to pull out here is that giving is out of a response to God's grace. He says, now I want you to know what God's grace has done through the churches in Macedonia. They have had many troubles, they're poor, but they're also filled with this abundant joy which has overflowed into rich generosity. So he starts out by saying, I want you to know what God's grace has done in that place. God's grace has done miraculous things. Well, if he wants to talk about God's grace, why is he bringing up the topic of money? Right? Because he says that these churches, pretty poor. They're experiencing tough times. They're in a difficult situation. However, the grace of God has impacted them so greatly that they are giving in a generous way that can't even be explained outside of the fact that they have been impacted by the grace of God. You want to know if somebody has been transformed by the grace of God? Look at their giving. Because most of the time, giving does not make any financial sense. And there has to be something going on that causes people to give in such a generous way. You may have noticed around here at Westridge during the offering time, we typically say, if you're not in a relationship with God, then don't give. And that's a pretty radical statement for people who are not followers of Jesus to hear, because I think the perception out there is that all the church wants is my money. right? And to be honest about it, there are some churches out there that are like that, but most are not. And we've made a commitment here at Westridge that we will not teach anything that is contrary to the Bible. And the Bible teaches this very clear foundational point that I think that if we get this, we can build on everything else, which is the fact that giving comes out of a response to the grace of God. It's not some tax that you pay. It is not giving out of some guilt trip where the pastor tries to manipulate us. If your life has not been radically transformed by Jesus, if you haven't experienced the profound forgiveness of God, then you have no reason to give, and you should not give. This is the foundation of giving. That God's grace has impacted us so much that we just have to do something. Paul uses a Greek word here, and I'll spare you my pronunciation of it, but it has the idea of the abundance or overflow. And so when he says the Macedonians were so filled up with gratitude for the grace of God that they just had to do something because they were so filled up with joy that it just spilled out of their lives over and over and over again in the form of generosity. They gave not out of an overflow of money, they gave out of an overflow of joy. And so there is this contrast between giving out of an abundance of wealth, which I think Paul was playing on words here, which didn't happen. In other words, giving only when we have a surplus cash flow versus giving out of an abundance of joy. No matter how much cash we have on hand, no matter how tight times are, we still give something meaningful, not because we have an abundance of cash, but because we have an abundance of joy. Because we are giving out of a response to God's grace, not out of a response to how much money we have or don't have. I mean, if you think about it, how many times do you really get ready to write that check in the offering in a meaningful way and you go, yeah, I can afford this? Most of us say, you know what, I really can't afford this. I can't afford to do that right now. We have so much coming at us right now. So it's not out of a response to how much money we have, it's a response to the abundance of joy and how radically transformed we've been. Which brings us to the next biblical principle that I want to bring out, and that is that giving is sacrificial. Verse 3 says, they gave not only what they could afford, but far more, even beyond their ability. I just had this conversation with one of my business partners just last week. For us, in the corporate world, October 15th is not only my wife's birthday, but it's also tax day for us. And so he asked, and he said, because our money's all kind of intermingled and stuff in our investments, and he said, so when you're talking about your tithe, are you tithing off the net or the gross? I said, well, that's a good question. I said, I always try to tithe off the gross because really, when you're tithing off the net, where do you draw the line, really? I mean, we can kind of fool ourselves into believing that we should be tithing off the net of the net of the net of the net, if you know what I'm saying, right? After taxes, after our mortgage payment, after our car payment, after our credit card debt, and a round of golf. I've got $100 left, and I am happy to make my tithe for the $10. While it's an ingenious financial plan to keep more money, it is not what the Bible teaches about tithing. Tithing is off of, in the Old Testament, describes it as our first fruit, right? It's our first crop, our best crop, as it's described in the agricultural way. But in our monetary way, it is our first dollars in. Before taxes, before mortgage, before bills get paid, before anything else, we tithe. We give 10% of our total income to God. However, I will say this. Tithing is, again, not a command. It is a standard by which the Bible sets us up. And so I would also say that if a tithe is not a meaningful gift for you, if it's not a meaningful amount of money for you to give, then in the New Testament it would probably be something we could assume is not enough. Because the Bible asks us to give in a meaningful way. And so it may be above and beyond a tithe that is a meaningful way to do sacrificial giving, which is what Jesus teaches. And so when I was in this conversation with my business partner, I said, this is what I give to Westridge. And he said, well, he's like, those are some serious investment dollars. I'm like, yeah, but my giving isn't on the table. And as we're scrambling to get cash for new deals in the company, that's not something that can be counted. I'm taking those dollars off the table right off the bat. It doesn't make any financial sense. I do it because this is what I want to do. And by the way, it is an investment for me because I consider it to be an investment in my church. When I'm giving my gift, I think about all of you. Like when I'm giving my offering, it's because I'm investing in us, right? As a community of people who stand together, who walk together, who make an impact in the world together. And so when I drop that check in the offering bag, it's for us. It's investing in our impact that we can have on the world, and it's investing in things that will last beyond the grave. My life has been so radically changed by the grace of God. And I was so screwed up. And for God to have forgiven the things that he has forgiven in my life, all I want to do is just say thanks. And I cannot even imagine not giving in a meaningful way. Now, I also, when I'm talking about sacrificial giving, I want to make a couple of points because, the Apostle Paul makes a pretty radical statement when he says, and they gave even beyond their ability, right? So that's a verse that a pastor could grab a hold on and say, even giving beyond your ability, and then to take this idea that God is going to, bless you. The whole prosperity gospel bugs the crap out of me, right? Because they're telling you that you should give, hit that line of credit, hit your credit card, God's going to pay you back in spades. You're going to get that back 10 times. Bible never promises that. Bible promises you will be blessed, not necessarily financially. You're going to love your life. You're going to have a sense of purpose. You're going to have a satisfied mind. But it doesn't mean that God's going to come and pour a bunch of money on you so that you can, be paid back for whatever it is that you've given. That is not the point of giving. And so when it says giving beyond your ability, those are things where we have to figure out that line, right? Of where we can give and where we can't give, and making sure that we're responsible in all areas of our lives. But here's the point that I want to make about sacrificial giving. The amount that we give is absolutely meaningless to God. God could care less whether you give $10 or $100 or $1,000 or $10,000 or $100,000. He could care less. What he cares about is that we are giving an amount that is meaningful to me. That when I write that check, I feel that. I feel that leaving my account. That is what stretches me. Paul was excited about the Macedonians' gift. Notice that he doesn't say how much they gave or challenge them and say, okay, we're going to have a thermostat over here and we're going to put how much money you've given to raise this particular amount of money. He never says that, right? He's excited about the Macedonians' gift, not because of the amount, but because they're poor. They're in the middle of hardship. And in the midst of that, they have given in a generous, generous way. And that's what excited him about that. third biblical principle is that giving is a privilege, not an obligation. In verse 3, it says, entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in the gift of those in need in Jerusalem. So Paul makes it clear that the Macedonians were not coerced. There was no manipulation going on to give. They gave of their own free will and actually pleaded with Paul over and over again according to him. And this word can be translated beg. I don't know. Sometimes you have a hard time believing this. I can't tell you the number of times when people have come up to me at Westridge and just begged me to put in more money into the offering. It's embarrassing, really, sometimes. I can't relate to this particular verse, but apparently the Macedonians were so pumped, uber pumped about giving that they pleaded with him to be able to give more. And that is something that's really apparent in this passage, is they weren't giving out of a sense of obligation. They found it to be a privilege to be able to give. I have to be honest with you, every now and then, I know it's going to be really hard for you to believe, but I get a little whiny about things. And I feel sorry for myself, and there's times when, I'll think about my volunteer responsibilities here at Westridge, and I'll get all victim-y about it, and there's times when I'm going to write that check, and, we don't have the cash flow to support it, and it's hard times, and I get a little whiny about all that. And, I have to stop myself and say, hey, dude, like, nobody's holding a gun to your head. Nobody's telling you you have to do this. This is not an obligation. This is something you want to do. So if you don't want to do it, don't do it. Right? This is something that we do because it's a privilege. I volunteer here. I write that check because it's a privilege. I believe in what we're up to here at Westridge. I believe that what I'm doing is investing in things that last for all of eternity. Giving should not be done with a whiny attitude because we don't have to do it. Giving is a privilege, not an obligation. And the reason why I say it's a privilege is because, look, when you have experienced the forgiveness, when you realize just how messed up your life was, or me, how messed up my life was, and the profound nature of the existence of sin in my life, and the forgiveness that I have received, and that I have received this grace, it is a privilege to be able to have this tangible way of just saying thank you to God for what he's done for me. Fourth biblical principle is that giving is a result of and causes spiritual growth. The Apostle Paul says, since you excel in so many ways, in your faith, your knowledge, your enthusiasm for God, your love, I also want you to excel in this gracious act of giving. So notice that the Apostle Paul puts giving right up there with faith and knowledge of the Scriptures and love for God. Giving is very much a part of our spiritual life. And so, as I said before, if you're not at a place in your relationship with God where you have a desire to give, then don't give. But I would also say that the opposite is true, if I'm speaking the truth. And that's if you're in a relationship with God and you're not giving in a meaningful way. In other words, if we're just dropping a few bucks in the offering bag as it goes around just to kind of fulfill that obligation and check that box, then I would challenge your perspective about that. Because giving is very much a part of the Christian life. There's a reason why the Bible talks about money so much. 5 times more it talks about money than faith or prayer for a reason. And it's because this really is an Achilles heel for so many of us. Money can just get such a grip on us. And I consider this, I see this so clearly in my own mind, that I really view giving as the practice of the letting go of this world. Every time we write that check, every time we drop that cash into the bag, every time we hit that button for text to give, we're letting go of another little piece of this world. Every time. And the more that we're able to let go of this world, the more capacity that we free up in our lives to be filled with the stuff of God. The more we give away, the more freed up we are to grow spiritually and to live the life that God has designed for us. Believe it or not, as we grow in our relationship with God, so does our desire to give. Because giving is a condition of where we're at spiritually. It has nothing to do with where we're at economically. Again, God doesn't care how much you give. He just cares that the amount that we give stretches you, challenges you, and causes you to grow in your faith. So what's the bottom line? How much do I have to give to get into heaven? Not even a dime. You don't have to give a thing. That's the right answer. But the real truth is, you have to give everything. Everything. God desires that we practice the letting go of this world. Letting go of the stuff that has no meaning, letting go of the stuff that drags us down, letting go of the stuff that is a distraction that takes us away from our focus on God. And the offering time that we have every week is the weekly practice of the letting go of this world. And God knows, if we don't start letting go of the stuff of this world now, we're going to cling tight to that stuff. We're going to get a little too comfortable, a little too attached, and we won't want to give it up. But I promise you this, there will come a moment in time when we have to let all of it go as we walk out of this world and into the next. It's a tough topic. Easy to talk about, tough to put into practice. Because we cling to the stuff of this world. It's what we can see and touch. Gives us a feeling of security. Gives us a sense of worth. But this is one of those things that makes a difference in how we walk through the rest of our lives. How we walk through this world. To invest in things that will last beyond the grave.